Hello, and welcome to Part 8 of the Hockey Basics series. I'm Mario in Black, and today we're going to talk about how the game day roster looks. I'll break it out into the position groups and talk about how lines operate and some of the basic ideas of constructing lines and defensive pairs. Let's get into it. First up, I want to go over the roster makeup. I've gone over this in prior presentations, but I figured it'd be good to go over it again as a setup of what's to come. Each team has 23 players on their active roster. All teams have up to 3 reserve players on their team that can be called up due to things like injuries. There's 21 players on the game day roster. 2 of them are goalies, and 19 are either forwards or defenders. Non-goalie players are generally called skaters as a collective to differentiate themselves from goalies, and it also gives the implication that goalies can't skate, which I know they love to hear. Generally, a game day roster will have 12 or 13 forwards, 6 or 7 defense, and then 2 goalies. There's an extra player that can be either a 13th forward or a 7th defender, depending on how a team constructs their game day roster. The example I'll have later shows an extra defender, so it's the first example in this particular bullet. Alright, here's an example of a game day roster. This is the Montreal Victoires roster against the Ottawa Charge in the 4th and final game of the 2026 Walter Cup Finals. You can see there's 12 forwards, 7 defenders, and 2 goalies. For several slides coming up, I'll be breaking this down further into lines and defensive pairs. I'll be using the roster for Game 4. It was also the same roster in Game 3. I'm going to be comparing and contrasting those 2 games. So now on to the line combinations and defensive pairs. Teams typically run 4 forward lines of 3 players. These are broken out as left wing, center, and right wing on each of the 4 lines. Teams also run 3 defensive pairs of 2 players, which is often broken out as left defense and right defense for the 3 pairs. A lot of times for forwards, you'll see the specific position they're in, such as left wing or center, but defenders are often only labeled as defenders and not given the label on which side they play on. It depends on where you're pulling the information from. The traditional breakout is for left-handed shooters to be left defenders and right-handed shooters to be right defenders, but handedness isn't always the determining factor. Each team has 2 goalies, one they'll start and one that's a backup. They only swap if the starter is injured or removed for a reason such as performance. Goalies don't follow the line patterns that forwards and defenders do, so they won't be looked at for the rest of this presentation. There's the extra player as mentioned, and they can fulfill the role of a forward or defender depending on what the team thinks they'll work best with. Teams have been fairly evenly split on which one they'll pick. It often comes down to who's healthy and what kind of personnel a team has. Lines and pairs are commonly numbered. The first line is usually the quote-unquote best line of a team. Teams will sometimes get cute with the naming conventions, but they generally have 4 lines, with the top lines and pairs getting more ice time than the bottom lines and pairs. As part of a strategy, teams may not put all their best players on one line, but they may spread them out so they have dangerous scorers on the ice as often as possible. Lines are not set in stone. A coach may mix up lines and move players around as they please. Sometimes a player could be hurt, forcing the issue, or a player from a lower line could be having a great game and the coach wants to see how they play on the line of better scorers. The team can also be having a rough game or a rough series of games, and the coach wants to mix things up and see how certain players play together. The coach may also just mix things up to see how players play with each other just in the middle of the season. The seasons are 30 games long at this point, so getting players used to playing with other players may help out as the season progresses, as you get into the playoffs, and giving players more experience up and down the roster. There's a ton of reasons why a line may look different on a given shift, and those were a few examples that I just gave. Here's Montreal's forward lines from the end of the playoffs last year. Each player on the left is the left wing, the middle is the center, and the right is the right wing. Over the next few slides, I'm going to show off the ice time of these players and discuss that in a little bit more detail. Alright, so on this slide, it's Game 4 of the finals where Montreal won 4-0. This is the game they ended up clinching the championship. For added context, the game was 0-0 after the first. Montreal led 1-0 after the second, and they scored 3 goals starting around the halfway mark of the third period. You can see from here that Montreal's top line all played the top 3 minutes of all the forwards here. all were over 16 minutes. The second line all played the next most amount of time, although you will see a discrepancy. The right wing, Murphy, actually played a little less than the third line right wing in Willoughby. The pattern follows through with the third and fourth lines as well. So outside of that right wing example of the second and third lines, every position group played more time than the player in the position group below them. This is a good example of a team spreading out the minutes pretty evenly. Montreal never trailed in this game, and by the middle of the third period, when they started scoring those goals to build out the lead, they were in full control. When a team is giving all the forwards time and not relying heavily on just their top players, it's often called rolling the lines. A coach is, rolling the lines through and giving everybody playing time. The advantage of this is that it keeps players fresh. You're not relying so heavily on your top players that they get fatigued. The inherent disadvantage is, your top players are top players for a reason. And the more they're on the ice, the more they could potentially impact the game. So it's that balance of trying to find, I need these top players out there to be fresh so they can impact at their, highest possible potential. But also I want them out there as much as possible. So finding the balance and, the type of game the players are playing will help determine that. And I'll show a good counter example in the next slide. Something good to know is that a team won't always just roll their lines 1, 2, 3, 4. Sometimes they'll send out the first line, the second line, the third line, and then they'll send the first line out again if they want to give their top line, more time. They may go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 3. It all depends on how the game's going. Sometimes they'll just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 if that's how it works. Sometimes coaches will, base it on matchups. They want their first line out there against a specific matchup, or they want their third line out there against a specific matchup because of the skill sets of some of their players. It's all dependent. Shifts are generally somewhere between 30 and 45 seconds, but there is some give and take based on circumstances. Like if a player just comes on and there's a quick whistle, they may sub off during the break and only be on the ice for a few seconds. Or a player can be caught on the ice for a long time, and have their shift last longer than the minute, say if they're hemmed into their own zone. So we're going to look at Game 3 of the Walter Cup Finals, which is a game Montreal lost 2-1. There's a winning goal by Ottawa scored with less than a minute left in the game. All 3 goals were scored in the third period, so this game was extremely close throughout. No team led by more than 1 goal. You'll see here the top line was up over 20 minutes with the exception of Poulin. During this period, Poulin was nursing an injury and likely would have been over 20 minutes had she been fully healthy, just that, for added context to that. The spread between the top line and the lower lines is also higher. You can see the second and third line players have similar time on ice numbers. Meanwhile, the fourth line all played under 10 minutes. Montreal relied more on their top end players here as the game was closer throughout and they weren't able to kind of roll their lines as they did in the Game 4 example. Montreal scored the first goal, so they at no point were they leading by more than 1 goal since they only scored the 1 goal in that game. And then Ottawa, relatively shortly after Montreal scored, ended up tying the game and then taking the lead and winning. So let's look at the difference between the 2 games. This is between Game 4 and Game 3. So these are how much the players played in Game 4 compared to how much they played in Game 3. Remember, Game 3 was the closer game, and Game 4 ended up kind of, being taken out of hand in the third period and ended up being a 4-0 win for Montreal. You can see all of the top line played less minutes in Game 4, the game that was a little more out of hand. Very significantly with Rock and Stacey, the 2 wings. They were down by more than 3 minutes of ice time. You can see on the second line, 2 of the players were down, while Grieg was up by nearly 2 minutes. And you can see the third line and the fourth line outside of Darkangelo, all the players had more playing time in the game that was, more of a blowout. So in the close game, all those top line players were out there more frequently and they could play them less in the game that was, more out of hand, or at least it got more out of hand in the third period. So here's Montreal's 3 defensive pairs. This also includes Nadia Mativi, who's the extra defender in this scenario. Montreal elected to dress a 7th defender for the last 2 games of the Walter Cup Finals. Montreal moved their defenders quite a bit, and you'll see it based on the times on ice. Erin Ambrose's health was a bit of a question, but she's someone who can play first pair minutes and often plays on the first pair when she's healthy. And as you'll see throughout this, she did, because these were very important games. You'll see in Game 4, it's not the best example of, the top pair playing more than the second pair playing more than the third pair. Montreal, kind of does things, a little out of the ordinary, although it's not too crazy to have defenders from lower pairs play more minutes than defenders on upper pairs, depending on how things break out. So the first pair played a significant chunk of this game, with Flaherty having the highest time on ice of any Montreal player. Defenders also tend to have a higher time on ice average, since there's less on a unit, with only 2 players per pair compared to the 3 on the lines. And there's also only 3 pairs of defenders as compared to the 4 lines. Gosling on the second pair actually played more than Tabin on the first by a little over 30 seconds. Ambrose on the third pair played the second most time after Flaherty. The extra defender, Mativi, even got nearly 12 minutes of action herself. Like I said, Montreal mixed up the pairs a bit. Ambrose played with Gosling quite a bit. They also used Mativi to give players an extra shift off to rest and recover, and they're able to roll her out there and kind of keep their defenders fresh. So looking at Game 3, which was the closer game, you can see the top 3 defenders in ice time from Game 4, Flaherty, Gosling, and Ambrose, all had significant playing time here as well. Mativi didn't play all that much. Montreal clearly relied on their big guns in this potential closing game. Montreal was up 2-0 in the series at the time and looking to sweep the series, which they did not, as it needed a Game 4. But as you can see, kind of mixed up and jumbled up again. The good example here is with Mativi, and I'll get to her a little bit more in the next slide. So breaking it out, the top pair did end up playing more time in Game 4, but the big difference is with the extra defender in Mativi. She was used a lot more in Game 4, more than 7 more minutes of ice time, compared to what she was at in Game 3. So, yeah, like I said, Montreal does so much mishmashing with their defense that this isn't the best pure example, but Mativi playing much more ice time is a good look at a coach being able to rest players a bit more and how that extra player can be such an asset. It's a similar idea with forward groups, when a team uses an extra player there and give players a break for an extra shift by using that extra player on their line in their space. But as I've mentioned, it all kind of depends on how the game's going. That had Game 4 been, close throughout, if it's 0-0 going into the final minute, or 1-1, or maybe a 1-goal game, maybe Mativi doesn't see as much ice time. And it could also be just a philosophical change. I didn't look at how the ice time was broken out within the game, but I wouldn't be surprised if they used Mativi more throughout this game, first, second, and third periods, because, they used up all these players so much in Game 3 that they're like, well, if we lose this game, we still have another game of finals to play, but let's try to get our defenders, as fresh as possible each time they come on the ice, and, to kind of stave off the Ottawa attack. So, like I said, a lot of coaching philosophy has something to do with this. Coaches kind of adjust game to game, and there's a whole lot that goes into this. So, like I said, not the best example, but kind of a good idea of how it works when it's a close game versus when it's, more of a blowout. Now on to the special teams. I'll start with the power plays. Teams generally run 2 power play units. In like lines, those are not set in stone, and any skater on the active roster can be on the power play. Unlike the lines and pairs, these are not separated by forwards and defense. They are all full 5-player units, or 4-player units if there's a 4-on-3 power play. You often see the top offensive players on the top power play unit, so if a team had a spread of their offensive talent across the lines, they may stack them all up on this top power play unit. Lots of power plays have 4 forwards and 1 defender. The defender is often called the power play quarterback, since they're the lone player on the point and will be the primary distributor of the puck. Some teams, and I'll show the example of Montreal here in the next bullet, will play with 3 forwards and a 2-defender setup. I looked at one of the Montreal playoff games and found that they ran a top unit of Rock, Poulin, Stacey, and they also ran Gosling and Ambrose, 2 defenders. The forwards are their normal top line, and they use defenders from their second and third pair, although Gosling and Ambrose ended up playing with each other normally during the game quite a bit as well. So Gosling and Ambrose themselves are both very proficient offensive players from the defensive position. The second unit in this example also used 2 centers Darkangelo and Willoughby, along with the right winger Murphy. They also use their top defensive pair of Tabin and Flaherty. A lot of times the second unit will be on the ice when the penalty expires, so teams will have two defenders on that unit, so they're better set up when the game returns to even or full strength. So this can also impact the ice times too. If a team is on the power play a lot, their players on the power play probably will end up with more ice time since they're part of that unit, and players that aren't on the power play may end up with less ice time. So that's another factor that can differentiate ice time up that sometimes comes up, and it's just something to be mindful of. So now on to penalty kills. Unlike power plays, penalty kills are often separated like normal 5-on-5 play, where forwards and defenders are in their own tandems. Since there's 4 players on the ice for most normal penalty kills, it's generally a forward pair and a defensive pair. The forward pair is something sorted out in practice. Teams will practice penalty kills and how they go about them. Specific forwards tend to play with each other on penalty kills. Usually they're forwards on the same line, not always, but that often comes up that they're forwards on the same, normal rotation line. Defensive pairs are similar to what you see 5-on-5. It's the 3 defensive pairs on their own tandems. There's not as much mixing up of players here. There are cases when mixing up has to happen because someone who's a reliable penalty killer will be in the box because they took the penalty and they're unavailable to the team. Then the coach will have to figure out how they'll roll out their penalty killers given what personnel is available. For 5-on-3 power plays, a penalty killing team will usually run 1 forward and 2 defenders. In fact, when there's a 5-on-3 power play, a team may elect to run 5 forwards if so they please. Although a lot of teams have good puck-moving defenders, and those are super valuable to have on a power play, even maybe more so than having 5 forwards. The wild card in all of this is with the no escape rule, which is a PWHL exclusive rule. When a team takes a penalty, they have to keep the players on the ice that were there when the penalty occurred and cannot change until the next time they can legally change players. So if that team loses the opening face-off and they're hemmed into their own zone, they're stuck with whoever was on the ice at the time of the penalty. This can only change at a whistle or during the run of play if they can move the puck down the ice and change on the fly as needed. This also messes things up if a defender takes a penalty in a 5-on-5 play. Now there's 3 forwards and 1 defender out to start the penalty kill. Looking at an example of what Montreal used on a penalty kill, Grieg and Skamura, who are normally on the same line, were on the same forward pair for the penalty kill that I looked up, and Tabin and Flaherty, who are normally on the same defensive pair, were the defensive pair for this. And they'll, if a player needs to swap or they're able to swap out, they'll swap out in forward and defense tandems depending on if they get the opportunity to. This isn't surprising. Teams like to have players that have good chemistry together in these situations. All right, I want to end this with a summary. Each team has 4 forward lines and 3 defensive pairs. They run preset lines and can mix and match these lines during the game as they please. There's also the extra player that is either a forward or a defender that can slot in when needed. Teams run 2 power play units and run forward and defensive pairs on penalty kills. The top offensive players are generally what you see on the power play, and the team likes to use its top defensive players on the penalty kill. The jailbreak rule also exists, which has a shorthanded team end the penalty whenever they score a goal. So teams will sometimes run top-end players on the penalty kill to increase those chances of a jailbreak goal and ending a penalty early. The downside to running these players on a penalty kill is that it'll likely increase their ice time, being out there for 5-on-5. If they're a top-end player, they're going to be out there on power plays, and then being out there on penalty kills as well. So, it depends on the player and, how much they're able to go in a given game. As seen with the Montreal example, especially with the forward groups on their team specifically, top-end players typically get the most ice time, and this time is increased even more in close games and can even be more so increased in close playoff games. Shifts typically range from 30 to 45 seconds depending on the circumstances. They could be a bit longer if the team is hemmed in their own zone. They can also be longer if a team is on like a power play and they've been attacking for a long time. It's been said by many players that the level of effort needed to defend is a lot higher than the level of effort needed when on the attack. So a player on the power play may be able to stay out a bit longer if the team has been attacking for a while. It makes sense when you think about it, because when you're on offense, you're in the proactive spot, while when you're on defense, you're in the reactive spot and you have no control over what's happening. So, the level of effort needed when you're on the attack, when you're proactive, you already kind of know what's coming. You've practiced all of these situations. While when you're on defense, you're reacting to what's happening, and that requires that extra little bit of effort and can wear players down, a little bit quicker. So that's it for today's video. Please leave any comments, any suggestions in the box below. I wish I had some better examples, but these were the best I could do. And like I said, these are all super variable. Not every close game is going to, see the top end players play a lot more, and not every blowout is going to see all the lines pretty equal. It all depends on the game, but that's kind of the general trend it follows. And even the examples I provided weren't perfect because, while game 4 was a 4-0 game, it still was pretty close. It was a 1-goal game until, about halfway through the third period. But hopefully, it kind of gave you a good idea and you kind of learned something overall. At any given game, it's going to be dependent on the coaches and the circumstances, how many power plays, how many penalty kills there are, and that sort of thing. So appreciate you watching. Like I said, leave any video ideas you have below. This was a video idea given to me, and I'm very happy to do it. And I'll be very happy to do whatever suggestion you have, as long as it's within my capabilities. This will be dropping the day phase 2 of the expansion process starts. So if you want to watch the video on the expansion process, you can look at my previous video on that. But we'll see how that turns out. I plan on doing a video on the PWHL draft, the entry draft, when the order gets all sorted out. And I may do a summary video on the expansion process as well when that's all over. But appreciate your time and hope you have a great day.